I'm waiting for the bell to ring. Yes, she is.
She was getting that way.
Did not have a good night and really bad headache this morning. No other flu-like symptoms. No body aches or stuff. So we're hoping it will arrest there. So.
Don't cough or sneeze.
I don't have anything. I'm good.
She's just making sure.
Okay. So we have a lottery going on which one of the preparation questions Greg's going to ask for reading chapter 13. Remember, there in the front of our book, there's all those questions that there's like 5 questions to ask yourself after you read that. So which one do you think? Okay, I won't make you guess. So when you read the chapter, you're thinking about it. What are the central themes that Paul is talking about in this chapter to the Romans? What's he emphasizing? What are the things that he wants us to remember as a part of the theme of where he's just been in chapter 12, and he rolls into chapter 13? So what are some of the things you see there?
Practical application.
Practical applications, certainly practical applications of Christian living. So that might be one way to say that. So
With relation to government responsibilities.
with relation to government. So he's talking about practical applications talking about how we interact with government. So what do you think? You think we might find something useful to us in this?
Definitely, perhaps.
I don't know anybody in here who's actually bought an island and is going to set up an island nation where you're the government there. So it's somewhat. So what? Any other themes you saw there?
Justice belongs to God, not us.
God's
Well,
role,
Yep.
government's role, and our role is another way to talk about that. So again, some things here that we find here. So very good. Now, I wasn't here last time, so I'm assuming you got good with chapter 12. You and I didn't have a chance to talk, so good. So everybody's going to remember what I'm about to ask them here.
Well, we hope.
We grade each other as teachers by how well you all do, right? So that's how. So I wasn't here for him to grade me either. So this is no, I'm just kidding. Chapter 12. Really, the last half, more than last half of chapter 12 was talking about the marks of a true Christian. I want us to start here because chapter 13 is a continuation of the discussion. And so let's get ourselves in the flow of the discussion. So what are some of the things, and we don't have to name them all, but what are some of the things, as Paul has come through all of this teaching about Jews and Gentiles and unity, and how we actually think about grace, and how we show grace to each other, and the grace God's shown us. He gets to chapter 12, and chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, some of those beautiful words in the Bible that are there. And then he gets into this section in practical living that we're going to continue here today. So, what are some of the marks of a true Christian that you would highlight out of that section?
Really love and be humble. Don't just pretend you love somebody, really love them.
Okay, what else? What are some phrases? Just walk wisely. Okay, what else?
Put on one another.
Put on Christ.
There's a lot of them there.
Serve the Lord.
Okay, keep going.
A hard one, bless those that persecute you.
Okay,
Preferring one another.
Don't burn out.
Show hospitality.
now we're cooking.
You be of the same mindset outlook.
Preach
rejoice with those who rejoice.
Pursue peace.
Okay. These things are largely said to what group of people and dealing with what group of people?
Members of the church dealing with the other members of the church.
Right, it's internally, right? It's about, if we actually gave chapter 12 a title, I don't remember what Mark gave in his thing, or I don't know if you gave him one, but I gave it a short one. Get along, right? This is how you get along as Christians. We're going to talk about that some more even in chapter 14 when we get there. But all of these things, marks of a true Christian, and all the other things that are here, places we could go in that chapter, we show those marks by how we interact with each other, right? I mean, that's the first place. If this isn't right, the rest of it's going to be off the rails. And so there's really a calling to that here that Paul is saying. And remember why he's having to say that to these Christians?
They weren't doing it.
They had, that's why this letter's here. They hadn't been doing it. There was all this disunity here, Jew and Greek, and all the things we talked about caused by the other pieces that are here. So that's kind of the entry here. But where else do we live besides the church?
The world.
We live in the world. Pursue peace, be of the same mind, show hospitality, prefer one another. How does that work with the world we live in? If we try to do that, does it just slide in the same way it does with Christians? That we can slide it over to this lane and go, hey, I'm going to practice the same things, and it's going to work out exactly the same way. Yeah, we'll have our problems at the church, and then we'll get it all worked out. Does that always happen in the world?
He said as much as is in you, do it. You
We'll talk
can't
about that, but
always
does
do
it happen? It doesn't, right? Because guess who is not of the same mindset? Christians and who?
The world.
Now it becomes harder. And chapter 13 is a little bit of just showing us how, yeah, it becomes harder. Now, here's how we're going to think about it and how to do that. So this, I really think this is, not only are there practical truths about dealing with government and dealing with worldly people in here, I think there are principles about how we should think as Christians, that when we encounter new situations about this, it's like, how do I act in this? And we may, by the time we get to the end of class, talk about some of those things. So, Christians and government. What is this chapter not talking about? Mark in his commentary chose to think about there. Okay, what is the biggest thing we have experienced in the last 3 months with Christians and government?
Elections.
Elections. And so what's a question about Christians and governments and election that you hear talked about an awful lot amongst Christians? Let's say it. Come on. Should I vote? Who should I vote for? All those other things that are here. Is Romans 13 about any of that?
Nope.
It's actually not. You want to talk about it, I could read you what voting was like in Rome at that time. They voted in Rome. This isn't about that. Maybe there's some principles we could take over to that, but this isn't about Christians and voting. What about Christians in the Revolutionary War? What side should they have taken? And were some of those Christians wrong for the side they took? I mean, there were rebels against the government, and this chapter says to obey the government.
Mark said it's 250 years ago. What's that to you?
Thank you. It's not about, this is not about theoretical what-if situations. And we get ourselves wrapped around, let's talk about the real situations. And there's Civil War. We'll see if this has some things for us here, but right now I don't see one coming, at least in the short term in doing that. What about the minutia of the law? I think we're just seeing in the last week how many wild and crazy things our government puts in regulations, does everything else. And is this about, as a Christian, I need to be reading those regulations of the law to make sure that I obey them all. Is that what this chapter is about?
You're going back to box checking.
kind of like that. I mean, is my attitude that I want to be law-abiding? It's not. It's not about those things. And looking at that, does this chapter say when the government requires me to do something that's wrong, in my understanding of me serving God, that I should just do it anyway?
No.
How do we know that? He's not saying that.
Acts 5, among other places.
Acts 5, verses 28 through 30. Peter and the apostles are pulled up in front of the council there, and they're asked, "Didn't we strictly tell you not to teach in this man's name? And look, you fill Jerusalem with it." And Peter's and you've put this man's blood on us. And Peter said, "What? Well, to obey God rather than men." And so clearly this chapter, we know going in, because of the track record coming to this, is not talking about what happens when the government is working contrary to our faith in doing that. There's other places we would go to that. And so, what is this chapter? This introduction thinking part. What is this chapter? Michelle?
I think has a lot to do with acknowledging and honoring that God establishes government and law, and he uses them for a reason. And if nothing else, like, that should be enough for us because we want to honor God.
So there's something about, if God's involved in this process, how would I think about this? Not that government is giving me God's inspired word, but God did set these up to either cause them to do things or allow them to do things. And I won't make you answer that, but do you think God allowed Peter in Acts 5 to be persecuted and the apostles to be persecuted for teaching the Word of God?
They could have stopped it.
Could have stopped it. He didn't. Their faith was tested. They passed the test. Maybe sometimes government does things that are wrong in order for God to see how we as Christians actually act in that thing. And does that mean God's the author of the wrong things? No. Because God has a world where all kinds of things are going. And as Mitch is want to say many times, that one's above my pay grade, what God's choosing to do and how he's choosing to carry it out. And sometimes we have to recognize that. Okay? So what is this chapter about? If you could pick up one word that would tell you something about the Christian's relationship with government, what one word could you pick out?
You already wrote it.
Oh, well, thank you for reading the Horn Carol.
I can read.
Okay. I think this is a wonderful word to embrace in your minds about Christians and government word submission. Now, tell me some things where the Bible talks about submission. Where are some places? What are some subjects? You don't have to give me the verses and ask you to do the research. Some subjects that submission is introduced to us in the Bible.
How about Christ is subject to God, the Father?
Wow, that's right, starting right at the top, right? Christ is in submission to God. Okay?
Children to parents.
Children to parents.
Under Caesar, render to Caesar what Caesar's.
Okay? That was a friend of Jesus. Render to Caesar.
Wives to husbands.
Wives to husbands.
Husbands to wives.
There is a sense, there is a husbands to wives to submission.
Good answer.
Good answer.
There's a mutual submission, and then there is an absolute one too in that, right? So what else?
The church and eldership.
The church to the elders. How about who are the elders in submission to?
Christ.
To Christ, the chief shepherd. Okay, so submission is a very common concept about how we serve God. It is littered throughout the relationships we have. That there is a sense of submission that's there, and so if we're going to add to this from Romans 13, what will we add?
Government.
Christians to government.
Christians, the government. And I want to make one point by doing all this, that, just to make sure we stay here. What happens when a husband tells a wife that she can't assemble with the saints? Should she assemble with the saints? She should make every effort to. That's a difficult situation. I know of cases where it's happened. What happens when the government tells the Christians we can't assemble with the saints? We have to find a way to do it one way or the other in doing that.
That's hierarchy.
Does that mean therefore that God's laws of submission don't apply, since we can find an exception to those? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. In the general order of things, it's much like one of our favorite proverbs: train up a child in the way they should go, and they're old enough to depart from it. So if a child departs from it when they're old, does that mean he or she wasn't trained up in the way they should go? Not necessarily. It's not an absolute that this will always happen, but what is it? It's a generality. It's a general truth that this will happen in doing that. And so think about this chapter in that way, because I think that helps us to understand what's here. Now, and we're all we're talking about the first question that Mark has: does instructions about submitting to civil government fit in to his theme here that he's been talking about? I'm going to talk in just a minute about how, see if we can get together how it fits together with unity. But I want you to ask yourself this, and then give me some answers. How does submission to a government show faith in God on the part of a Christian? How does submission to our government show faith in God as a part of our Christian? Several levels of answers here.
I'd say
The easy one is what God said in Romans 13, right? He said to do it, and so we show faith in God by obeying His command, and so He said to do it. So that is certainly a place to start, because that's always a place to start.
Verse 2, therefore whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed.
Right, so if we're resisting government, we're resisting what God's appointed. So
Yeah.
there's a sense of actually being rebellious to God when we're like that. What else?
Shows our confidence in Him that He can take care of this without
Yeah.
us.
Exactly.
And what kind of faith did Abraham show when he was asked to do something hard?
Confident faith.
He was gonna do it.
He did it, not understanding how. Now, let me ask you some things. Over the last 10 years, our government done anything that you really don't understand how obeying them on this is gonna work out for you?
Yeah.
We can pick any 10-year period, I think we can say that.
Particularly for.
Much like the Romans trying to work out their salvation by works, by checking all the boxes, by doing all the things, by being perfect law keepers. When we actually decide, well, we have to be able to decide everything the government does and how it fits in with God's law and everything else. The reality is, does everything government does fit in with God's law? Well, in one sense, it's either compatible with it or incompatible with it. But God's not revealing His law through governments, and that's not what this chapter says. Governments, though, are serving a purpose, and the purpose is God-given. And we can learn something about that from Romans 13, which then will help us as we relate to government. How are we fitting in with what government's doing for a God-given purpose? Now, I want us to do another board here. We're doing boards this morning. We talked some in generalities, some specifics. I want to get specific. So if you haven't got your Bibles open to Romans 13, verses 1 through 7, open them there. What does Paul specifically say about being submissive to our government? What does he specifically say?
Resisting the government is opposing God.
Okay? Okay, what's another?
And the judgment that comes as a result of that resisting is your own fault.
You will receive judgment. From where? Where's the first place you'll receive judgment from if you're resisting the government?
The government.
The government. and possibly God. Because guess what? Peter was resisting the government in Acts 5 and received judgment. It wasn't judgment from God, but it was judgment from the government. So, what else does he specifically say?
Pay taxes. Pay taxes.
I was
that
hoping
what
you
you're
wouldn't
talking
say that.
Yeah.
Pay taxes?
Sensitive time of year.
Be subject is listed a few times.
In various ways, over and over again. That's one of those repeated words, phrases, and concepts that is there. That's the overall. We're gonna talk about the why here in a minute and do that.
If you live godly, you don't have to worry about the government,
No fear
retribution from the government.
in obeying government.
Conscience goes into that.
Good conscience in obeying government. You got half my list up here. What's the other half? It's all in Scripture.
Honored him and respected.
Honor. Respect. I thought I'm only supposed to honor and respect my favorite candidates.
It's easier. Well, I was saying it's easier to honor and respect your favorites.
No doubt about that.
Do what is good.
Do good. See if there's anything else I wanted to bring out here.
The rulers are out to get the bad guys.
Rulers punish evil. How far can that punishment go?
Yeah.
All the way.
With the sword. Okay. Anything else that you thought of?
When we tie it back to the end of chapter 12, where he says, don't take your own revenge, he set up the government.
God is the avenger. And chapter 13 says sometimes he's using the government for that. Sometimes it's God himself who's doing that. But excellent thought. I've always kind of wanted to talk about this. Well, let's back it up this way. What's the American concept that gets in the way of this chapter? That we love and live by?
Freedom.
Freedom.
Live the way you wanna live.
Live the way I wanna live.
We wanna do what we wanna do.
Nobody's bossing me.
Nobody's gonna tell me what to do at the end of the day.
Independence.
I'm independent. I can think for myself. I can decide for myself what I'm gonna do and not do. We've actually created a pretty good country on those concepts, right? So how do we think as Christians living in a society where that's a part of our culture? A whole bunch of other things are part of our culture we could talk about, but that's part of our culture too, in doing that. How do we think about this?
Submission comes hard to anybody, particularly to a government that we don't approve of.
It does. How much of the attention of almost everything we see publicly is drawn to what the government's doing in today's society? Whether people like it or don't like it, do we hear that pretty often?
Always.
All the time. Do you think Romans 13 is actually telling Christians to have their main focus on the government? Boy, that's the hard lesson for me. Don't think about how if we just change the government, our world's going to change. Things are going to be better, and all these other things that there. Is that really true? Is the government actually charged with doing that? Is there anything in this chapter that tells us that we should work through the government to make things better for all people in our neighborhood and everything else? Is there anything in there at all? There's kind of not. Okay? So what do you think he gave? Let's just go to them first. I think we can learn something by going to the Romans. Why would this particular lesson about be subject, obey the government? I mean, Rome wasn't a great government. I think we might have taken Rome's government over some of our governments, but I take ours most of the time over Rome's government. about what useful outcome would there be for Christians in paying attention to this 58 AD or so? Yeah.
These instructions were given so that people could live peaceful lives without being bothered and persecuted by the government. If
Right.
you kept your head down and did your work and lived within the parameters of the guidelines that the authorities were giving you, then you could have a better chance to living a peaceful life and do the work of God in peace.
I think it's exactly right. And how do they know that? What has happened to them? Well, half the Christians were kicked out. Now, we don't know if Jewish Christians were involved in the riots that caused Rome to kick out all the Jewish people. What do you think? Do you think it's likely that some Jewish Christian was involved in that there were some public arguments that something had to happen between people of opposing sides? And the subject we know in Rome where all the riots came from were the Jewish Christians and the Jewish non-Christians arguing with each other. It wasn't really Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians arguing with each other. It was Jewish and Jewish. So bad that all the Jewish people got kicked out. How disruptive was that to people's lives?
Quite.
How disruptive was that to the church? Were there any residual effects in the church?
Yeah.
All of this disunity that's by the Jews coming back in, and while the Gentiles have progressed, we've talked about all that over and over again. Had they actually have been had the Jewish Christians not taken to the streets to argue with the Jewish non-Christians and have these riots? Where would the gospel enter Rome without that? We don't know. That's an alternate history that we can't see. The point of this is, in some ways, specifically these people, Paul's telling them, don't do that again. That's the wrong approach. That is not how you change people's hearts, by going to the streets and doing this. In fact, you're going totally counter to the government, because what did the Roman government want? Did they want Christianity or not Christianity? Did they want either of those things? They didn't even know about it. What did they want? Peace. They had all these people of all these different backgrounds. There was all these reasons for clashing, and what Rome wanted in order for them to progress as a society, and quite frankly for the rulers to get richer and richer, was a peaceful society where people did their roles, paid their taxes, and they were able to do that. Is that incompatible with a Christian's life? That in general, don't be involved in civil insurrection, but stay focused on your life as a Christian and just kind of let those things. It actually is, and I think that's really, there are a lot of excellent specific teachings that we have to look here. But if you look at the general teaching, that when we choose to go counter to the government and be involved in those kind of things, we are distracted from our main job. And quite frankly, we could even be doing something that inherently is not wrong, but are we creating for ourselves problems that are going to have worse problems than just living with something that we don't like? It's a hard question. I mean, I can make a whole list of issues that go, it's a hard question about. It's a hard question about abortion. It's a hard question about a lot of other things. But the reality is, however much we work, we're not going to change people's hearts at the government level. Where are we going to change people's hearts? And actually, who's going to do the heart changing? The gospel, the power of God to salvation, is going to do the heart changing. And the more we can stay focused on that, the better off that we are. Mitch.
You know, I think in addition to helping them right then, they're only a few years away from becoming lampposts, where they're going to be major Christians being killed by the tens of thousands coming, not very far away, the end of Nero's time. And some of the historians at least said that they could not understand how a Christian could endure what they had to endure without taking to the streets. Now, there's a few, Masada and those kinds of things, but Most Christians took it, and it got really rough only a few years from when this book was written.
It did. And there's something about when that happened, even there is something God allowed to happen. And we look at this and, you know, we don't have time to jump into this, but I was just thinking, because the kids at Team Weekend talked about Daniel. What do you think when Daniel and his 3 friends were challenged to eat the food that they shouldn't eat? Did they lead a riot and an insurrection? What'd they do?
They quietly followed God.
Quietly followed God. They proposed something quietly. They actually worked it out. When the idol that was 3 times taller than the tower in our building was set up and said everybody has to worship it, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't do it. Did they lead a protest out there not to do it? How did they? They just did. They just kept doing the right thing. And eventually the government found them out, the people who were looking at that, and they basically said, well, God can save us. If he doesn't, we still ain't gonna do this because we're doing what's right. What about when Daniel was under the Medes and Persians was actually was charged with actually doing the same kind of things? Where did he choose to go instead? Lion's Den.
Kept praying.
So when chapter 13 and verse 7 says, "Pay to all what's owed to them, pay your taxes," is that the actual most important phrase in that verse? What do you think is the most important phrase in that verse?
Respect.
Respect to whom respect is due,
And
honor whom honor is due. Was Nebuchadnezzar honorable? No.
But we can see the good influence Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they all had when they continued to obey God. Look what happened in the long run.
It did, and look at, I just went back in Acts, because we just finished up Acts, and just think about those interactions Paul had with the government there. Paul apologized when lashing out against the high priest, when he said,
Didn't know
I was wrong, I didn't know it was the high priest. If I did, I wouldn't have said that. How did Paul treat Felix and Festus and Agrippa?
Oh, most honorable.
Called them all honorable. Were they honorable men? Not at all, but they had honorable positions. And how did Paul approach it? He did the same thing he's telling them here today. Andy?
And also thinking about Acts, when Paul and Silas were in prison, the earthquake happened, and the jailer was about to kill himself. But then Paul shouts out and says, no, we're all still in here. You know, we didn't escape.
We didn't run.
run away. And so we see the conversion right after that.
We did. And then they go back to prison, right? After that. They get released properly in doing that. Isn't it interesting that if we actually don't go out of our way to make ourselves targets, we still might become targets, because the government can turn against Christians. Governments have turned against Christians. They will again. There are places in this country where that's the case. But making ourselves targets, to be seen, to get noticed, that's not showing honor to the government. That's not showing honor to Christ in looking at this. And I think that's part of this overall teaching. So, yeah, Mitch, go ahead.
Real
Yeah.
quick. To me, I think it also demonstrates to them and to us that if you're willing to do all of that, submit through all of these hard times to people looking, there must be something to this. This example that there must be something to this for them to just submit and have these things done to them.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what was the outcome of that one? What did Nebuchadnezzar do? Promoted them and said, their God is the greatest God in doing all of this and making that happen. And yet they, in the midst of this, showed what we just talked about earlier, that faith. The faith to actually trust God when he says obey the government, even when the government is doing that to you, says whatever happens on the other side of this, God's behind it, and God's going to use it for his honor and glory. Carol?
The flip side of the same coin is if you're not obeying the government, you're not setting an example to the people around you to emulate Christ and become
I think
to
that
bring the gospel.
I think that's exactly right in looking at this. And the fact that Paul says, you're not gonna have a good conscience if you're living like that. When do we not have a good conscience? What's a troubled conscience a sign of?
When you're not following God's laws.
Which is, what's another word we have for that? We're sinning, right? Our conscience hurts when we're doing something we know is wrong, and there's something about deciding that this is the right path that it's like, no, even your conscience knows that this is not the right path. And we could talk about Jesus in all of this, and how did he approach these things in doing that. So, ask you this question. So how should we vote in elections?
You just answered it.
Say, just because the government says something's legal doesn't mean it's morally or ethically correct.
Right.
So that's our position too. Even
No matter
though
what
the
party.
law says you're allowed to do that, well, we have to understand that we can't do that.
When's the last true Christian you had put in front of you on the ballot?
It's hard to say.
Hard to say.
1850s,
Maybe.
whenever President
Gar-
Garfield.
Garfield, maybe the only one in American history that we would look and say, you know, was a true Christian in doing that. And so, we can vote, we can not vote, we can vote for one side or the other. We could talk about what principles we might use in voting. This chapter doesn't give you any of that. This chapter is about your general demeanor is you're in submission to the government. And if the government made me vote, I had a friend in Hungary, in the communist Hungary, where everybody had to vote. And they had to line up in order, and they actually stack their ballots in order so they know who voted what way. Guess what? He got the news. That's how I vote. By the way, that's how they voted in Rome too. You know, whatever you want me to do, I'll just go do it. I don't care, you know, for doing that, because I want to get back with my business of serving God and doing that. So
And I
that's,
think if we pray first before we even consider voting, our conscience will more or less lead us the right direction.
it will, and if the person we voted for doesn't win, what do we do?
Oh, we gripe and complain personally.
That's what we do. What do we do here?
Take to the media.
Have they put some people in front of us it's pretty hard to do this with?
Yes.
Pick the lesser of the evil.
We follow God, we follow God's will in doing that. So, it's tax season. Do we need to talk more about that? How does paying taxes help us? Paying taxes is a part of, that's how the government funds itself to be there. Jesus said, you know, hey, I wish I like Jesus, I could go fishing and come up with the money to pay them off, you know, and doing that. Maybe paying up to stand more than that.
Preaching to God, what's God?
But that's it. I mean, it's just pay them and move on. Why again was that, might he specifically say that to a church that had a bunch of Jewish people in it? Well, how did the Jewish people think about tax collectors in their history?
I thought they were bad.
How do they accuse Jesus of? You hang out with two kinds of people, sinners and tax collectors. There's that ingrained just disdain for them there, and it's like, nah, pay your taxes and move on. I mean, and that's just about it. Isn't it interesting how he pivots in now in verses 8 through 10 from pay your taxes to what does he then say?
Love.
Love your neighbor. Now, how are those connected? How does he connect those two? Paying our taxes is paying what we owe to the government. How does that connect to verse 8? What's the connecting phrase he uses? First phrase of verse 8. Don't owe anyone anything except
To love.
to love. Okay, was that can't have a mortgage? No, that's always not talking about. Not talking about if we're not going to create he's been talking about honor the government, pay their taxes, be in submission. If that's the case, now how do we begin to generalize this? Because this is really Paul turning the chapter to chapter 14, where he's going to talk about now how do we all get along after all of these lessons here about unity and doing that. It's where he's headed. So this is a bridge. So yes, you show submission to this, but now where do you show submission? And he goes right back to the law. And where did he pick from the law?
10 Commandments.
He picked the commandments, and what did he say at the end of it?
Love.
After saying all of that, he says, love your neighbors yourself.
Right. And then he says, love fulfills what? Who else said that? Jesus said that, and he endorsed one particular scribe who actually answered him correctly on that. And Jesus said to that scribe, "You are not far from the kingdom of God," when he understood that. That it wasn't about checking the boxes. It was about, if your motivation is through love for another person, whether it's love for God so that I can go as far as submitting to the government, or if it's love for your fellow Christian, your neighbor in the church, my general way of action is I'm working for your best interest. And if you're always working for somebody else's best interest, it's almost impossible to do one of these things, these thou shalt nots. It's obvious that thou shalt not do all these things. Why? Because you actually now have the heart God's looking for. God wasn't looking at the heart of a checkboxer. He was looking for the heart of someone who actually would trust him. And if trust him to treat your neighbor the right way, he's going to take care of you no matter what the consequences has come. Okay, so last section here before the buzzer hits again. What does verses 11 and 12 say about Christians sticking their hand in the sand and not being aware of what's happening around them?
Wake up.
How can you submit to something you're choosing to not participate in? Can't do that, can't have it both ways.
Yeah. How actively is evil working in the world right now? Did it work while you were asleep last night? Is it going to work tonight while you're asleep? Of course, Mark had to say this in his commentary because he's got the coffee in there, but it was really, wake up, smell the coffee.
I got a little tired of his coffee.
Well, don't read his next book, he's got more coffee in it. But it's get on with doing the right things. Yes, honor the government, get your focus on this, get on with treating each other the way you should, and then chapter 14 is going to be, let's talk about how we do that. Good class, I hope it was helpful, and